I'm Dr. Carol McMahon. I am currently the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine here in Columbia, South Carolina. And I'm also a clinical associate professor of pathology because medically that's my background. I'm a pathologist. And in that position, I work in the Department of Pathology, Microbiology, and Immunology at the School of Medicine. And I primarily teach second-year medical students, but also occasionally some graduate courses. Honestly,
Yeah.
I did not start out. When I chose to go to medical school and I was finishing up, I was going to do OBGYN, obstetrics and gynecology. And in fact, I did for a year, but I would go to the pathology lab and I would look at the specimens grossly. And then there was a wonderful resident who would say, come back tomorrow and look at the slides with me. And I would go back the next day. And over time, and this was the pre-HIPAA days, over time I found myself just stopping by daily to say, what do you have interesting? And so she or some of the other residents would share cases with me. And it was more about cases versus actual patients' names. But I don't think I could do that. I don't think you could get away with that today because it's still confidentiality issues. But as a result of doing that, I chose to switch fields. Two things, actually, when I said oncology specimens in particular. So it was being in gynecology, it was the ovarian tumors, which could be quite large and just very interesting. So I would find that, if there was a way I could break scrub or after the procedure, because they can be very lengthy. Surgeries can be very lengthy. And back in those days, I hate to tell you how long ago that was, a first year postgraduate trainee. So we call them interns. Now it's called postgraduate trainee year one. A lot of times you were more or less like still a fourth year medical student in some of the procedures. You really weren't doing much. And if I could break scrub at some point in a marathon 4, 5, 6 hour procedure, I would, as long as the attending allowed it. And I would go to the pathology laboratory. It was just, you check on the patients that you had. Sure, I didn't neglect what I was supposed to be there for. But when I had free moments, I always sort of gravitated just to the pathology laboratory. And I think two things made it. The cases were interesting, but for the same reason people go to medical school, I say this all the time, it's usually an experience or an individual, like a mentor. And so in the pathology lab, there was a resident, another female resident, and she was so welcoming to this, first year trainee who was not in the field, who was coming down and pestering her, what do you have good today? She was so welcoming. She'd say, oh yes, come, let me show you. And it just kind of snowballed from there. So it was the cases, but it was also the people. And I have to admit, if I'm totally honest, it was the time. As I looked down the road in terms of being able to have a life outside of medicine, pathology afforded that more so than obstetrics and gynecology did at the time. So it was, I would say, those three factors. Age. I think part of, doctor comes from the Latin word that means to teach. So you're always teaching even when you're in the clinical arena. And when I switched from obstetrics and gynecology to pathology, I did the 4-year residency, and then I did a fellowship. I had an opportunity to do a fellowship in forensic pathology, which was not that common. I mean, it wasn't as well known, I guess, back then as it is today. It wasn't all the rage then as it is all the different television programs. But I did a fellowship, and 3/4 of the way through my fellowship, one of the attendings in the medical examiner's office I was working at relocated to another part of the country. And at that point, the chief said, when you're done, when you finish the fellowship, you can have that position if you're interested. And so I ended up being a medical examiner in Washington, D.C. for a little over 8 years. And so when I moved here, my former husband is from here. When I moved here, I continued doing that, doing forensic pathology. But I have to tell you, there's a huge difference working in a state versus working in Washington, D.C., because D.C. is 10 square miles. Think about that.
It is.
Jurisdiction you're covering. South Carolina is a whole state, and so we'd get cases from all over the state. That meant traveling to cases in terms of court all over the state, and that became a little bit more onerous, a little bit more difficult. So I cut back on that at the same time that I was offered a very part-time position here at the University of Medicine. So I continued doing both for a while until it became too much. And so over time, I slowly became more academic than practicing. And by 2006, so about 16 years ago, I became full time here at the School of Medicine, which was a good time in terms of age as well. Pathologists, and I really, most physicians now work, they're employees, they work for somebody, as opposed to single shingle. And when I was growing up, it was fee for service. There were a lot of single shingle practicing physicians, you know. You don't see that much anymore. It's really groups, and it's groups independently, say an orthopedic group or a pathology group or an internal medicine group or a family medicine group, or there are big groups within these big hospital systems. Okay. So to answer your question, basically, when I finished my pathology residency, I in part chose to do a fellowship in forensic pathology because I thought it would make me more marketable as a pathologist, because pathologists have always kind of worked for laboratories, for big lab companies, or in academic settings of some sort, but they work in groups and they work for somebody. So even working as a medical examiner, where I was from, we worked under the aegis of the Department of Health. Okay. But I thought doing the forensic pathology fellowship would make me more marketable if I ended up who knows where in the country. And so that's how that segue happened. And then it just so happened that during the fellowship, I was offered the full-time position. So it did make me more marketable when I moved here, because I continued doing forensic pathology and also doing consulting on forensic cases. Okay, it's first of all, I need to disavow people of the thought that everything you see in forensic pathology is violence, because that's not true. So basically, you're charged with examining sudden, unexpected, and unattended deaths. Okay, now those can be deaths due to actual pathologic processes, medical processes that have not been diagnosed or not been attended to. But the other sorts of cases obviously are going to be, and particularly sudden unexpected death in young individuals. Okay. So who've not been under any medical care and who have no known medical history. The other sorts of cases would be deaths that occur. These are all the cases under forensic. Deaths that occur under unusual circumstances. Okay. Among those would be death in police custody, death in group homes, whether it's in prison or whether it's in an assisted living facility. And then obviously then you get your deaths that are due to suspicious circumstances or to violence. So motor vehicle accidents, trauma from falls, whether those are accidental falls or someone pushed somebody, or falls from suicides. And then, of course, your homicides, your shootings and your stabbings and your beatings and that sort. But what gets the TV going are all the violent ones. But we see a lot of cases where the manner of death is natural because it's a heart attack where the patient never made it to the hospital, okay? Or it's a stroke where the patient never made it to the hospital. With medicine, you develop a certain level of objectivity where you can step back from what you're seeing in a patient. Obviously, seeing death every day makes you more aware of your mortality. You know, in that you might be seeing someone who was alive yesterday and dead today. So it makes you very careful, I have to say, I think sometimes I'm more aware of my surroundings than some of my friends. But otherwise, I don't think it's that different than medicine. I used to tell people when people said, how can you do that? Especially some of my former OBGYN colleagues who said, how can you go from birth to death? I said, well, imagine being a GI doctor who's doing endoscopies or colonoscopies all day. I mean, medicine has its gross elements to it. And yes, there were some real tragedies, but yes, it was pure pathology. And so it was interesting, and you're able to deal with it objectively. I would say almost analogously the way someone who's an oncologist can deal with death of patients because of what their disease process does. That's true, and that's a very good point because the motivation is to help people. But interestingly enough, pathology has led to helping people on a more grand scale. If you go back in time, for instance, some of what we take for granted in terms of safety features, from cribs to automobile design, in terms of seat belts, 3-point seat belts, airbags, second generation airbags, crib railings and whatnot. All of that came from studies of what happened, sadly, in those who had died from from trauma. To be honest with you, I'm rather privileged. My father was a doctor, so I was
Okay.
around medicine, but and I was interested in it. But I really loved history. But
Mm,
I spent summers and some other, like vacations. I would work in my father's, and again, that's how I know about single shingle practice in my father's office. But I was more the front desk person. Um,
mm,
but still, I think my father was just amazing to me. He could do anything. And
mm,
I'll never forget, I mean, obviously he treated patients. And what I loved about his work was, even though he was an obstetrician gynecologist, which is, I was going to follow in his footsteps and work with him, his practice was more of a family practice. And in those days, it was also patients sometimes paid via bartering. So I'll never forget, there was this one patient whose husband they lived on a farm for one thing. And the patient's husband was a pastry chef at a rather famous hotel in Washington, D.C. It's gone now, but he made the best pecan pies and cheesecakes, and they would always bring, for the office visits, they always brought all this produce plus the pies and I just looked at it and I thought, this is just great. I mean, my father can do anything, and look how he gets paid. Um, but I'll never forget, what really brought it home to me too is that I grew up having dogs, and we had a dog that had a fall. And my father actually did CPR on the dog and brought him back, and I just thought he could do anything. I wanted to be like him. So that's where it started. Just admiration for my dad and wanting to be like him. And it's funny because I'm on the admissions committee here. And when we get students who are also, children of physicians, it's always like, well, they're privileged and they're only doing this because of the parent. And I'm
mm,
like, but not so fast. Again, we are inspired to do something either based on an experience that we have or based on an individual. And I was just fortunate that that individual was my very own father. So it started fairly young. But I also had some very wonderful teachers starting in fifth grade who were history teachers. And growing up, I grew up in Washington, D.C. So growing up in Washington, where you're surrounded with national history, I was
mm,
also fascinated with that. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but being a doctor was always kind of there. My high school really didn't focus much on science. It was more in the humanities. So that was partially why I had why I was torn. But definitely when I went to college, I was definitely determined to become a doctor then. So that's when I started doing the science courses. Actually, I had the support, but nobody pushed me. Even he didn't push me. If
mm,
anything, he used to say, get a good desk job because, or be like him. My mother was a social worker, a medical social worker.
mm,
And it was more like, because I think he was thinking, I see the good part. I mean, I grew up hearing him go out in the middle of the night to deliver babies. And I don't think he wanted me to be going out in the middle of the night. So while I had his support, I also had his thinking, this may not, I had a feeling he thought this may not be for you because it's it's a little more difficult. And I know this almost sounds sexist in today's world, but it's a little more difficult for a woman to juggle the two, the having the family and being the doctor. And he was
Yeah.
right. I mean, I have to admit, he was right. Um, because I went to medical school in, actually finished in 1980, and the mantra of the 80s was a woman could do whatever she wanted to do and could do it all. There was an ad on TV where you could bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan. In other words, you could do it all. It's a difficult juggling act, and you can't do it all without a support. So I had the support, but I didn't feel any push to necessarily
Yeah.
follow in his footsteps because he knew the difficult side in terms of lifestyle that it would be for a female. And
Yeah.
I know that sounds so odd in today's time, but he was right. I have to say he was right. So,
Yeah.
but I
Especially
think
with,
that's why when I told him I was not going to continue in obstetrics and gynecology, but rather I was going to switch to pathology, I think he was really happier about that than maybe I was because he realized, well, that's a good fit. And truth
hmm
be told, I guess you'd say about a generation and a half ago or more, but his generation of female physicians generally did what we call the four P's: pediatrics, pathology, psychiatry, and physiatry, which is physical medicine and rehabilitation, because those were the four fields that a woman could do and still have that nice family life medical career balance.
mm,
The,
interesting.
the biggest obstacle was, while I had had some science courses in high school, mainly biology type courses. When I got to college, it was daunting because I went to a small school. It was daunting to be in these big lecture classrooms with 300 or more people, many of whom were also pre-med. So that was a little daunting and at times discouraging. But
Mm,
that was the biggest obstacle. But I was still determined. Yeah.
yeah. And from my experience, that first year in college is like a transition kind of adjustment period. So, yeah, the word,
And I tell everyone that I talk to who's college bound, and I think that's the when to get to people, is that if you say you're pre-med, a lot of times they will give you sort of an algorithm of the courses you should take and when you should take them. And I feel throw that in the trash because I think at least for the first semester of the first year, you need that time to adapt to being in college, being independent or semi-independent,
mhm,
um, being away from home for many people, and not having the same sort of structure and rigidity that you may have had with high school, because you're
mhm,
much more dependent on your own, but your own good study habits and
mhm,
determination, and
mhm,
so and you can't put things off, and so it's a little, it's an you're absolutely right, it's an adjustment. So I tell them to, for instance, at USC, it used to be common to say when you come in, take biology 101 and 102 and chem 111 and 112 with the labs in the freshman year. And I
mhm.
felt that was a prescription for failure for some students, depending on what high school, what area they came from, because it
Yeah.
was too much and it was too difficult. I would say take one at a time.
Mhm.
And if you're going to double up on those pre-medical sciences that you need, medical schools, like, we don't require them anymore, but obviously you need them if you're going to take the MCAT, which we do require. So
Mhm.
my suggestion was to double up in your sophomore and junior years, but not that freshman year, not the minute you set foot on campus, because it's a prescription for failure. And if you mess up that first semester of the first year, you feel like your whole dream is
Yeah.
gone out the window. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. People like you. All right. And why do I say that? I'm not just saying that to be nice. No, but I love meeting young people who are starting out in their careers. I find that they're idealistic As I become older, I get a little jaded. And there are days where I feel, part of the reason I haven't yet retired is the people that I come in contact with in the academic setting, the young people who are, really enthusiastic about the future and about their futures and what they can do in medicine or in the biomedical sciences, and who bring that, again, that hope and idealism and, sort of, I won't say open mind, but just to bring a different perspective. And it helps me have hope for the future. I think the other part is I still like to learn, and I'm constantly learning. And you learn from different people. So I learn things from students. I learn things from the facilities staff. You just learn something all the time. So what I like most is the people and the whole learning. What I don't like is to get really, is sometimes it feels like either there's constant change, and is the change really just change for change's sake, or is it effective change? Like the minute we think we're doing something right, it's like, well, no, let's try to do it this way. And so sometimes that's where I can get a little jaded and think, if it wasn't good, then why are we trying something new? But again, the young people make me realize, let's try something new.
I love that.
Well, STEM is obviously, you break it down, it's science. So are they interested in biomedical science? Or are they interested in, let's break down the different elements and focus on what exactly are they interested in? Are they interested in life science, well, biomedical sciences, but the life sciences in terms of the environment, okay?
Right.
Technology, okay, there we go. I sometimes worry, and this is where my age shows, I worry that the technology is taking over us and starting to control us. I'm still old school. I use cash. I like cash. I write checks. And I will go to the bank to deposit a check, whereas my son will tell me, oh, you can just do it on your phone. I'm like, I don't want to do everything on my phone. I don't want this thing to be, I don't want this thing to be controlling me. So, and plus I said, for me, I tell him all the time, it eliminates jobs. Those are jobs that are going if we do everything by phone. But granted, technology is the future. So are they interested in, say, computer technology or other forms of technology? Engineering, I know very little about, but obviously it's something we need when we look at infrastructure. So is that the element they're interested in? And then there's mathematics. So take what that acronym means apart and look at exactly what they are interested in. I think the biggest thing too is don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed, especially at 14 or 15 or 13, and be so consumed that you don't explore all of, the word liberal has gotten a bad connotation, but liberal arts means broad education. And so I don't want people to forget about the joys of the arts versus STEM, because what we do know is a lot of musicians are also very talented when it comes to the different elements of STEM.
Absolutely.
So any other things you enjoy, don't push those to the side or let them go by the wayside while you focus just on science, technology, engineering fields, or math, okay? Because it's a long road ahead, and the reason I say this, I don't want people to get burned out. So at 13, 14, 15, so 15 is high school,
freshman,
right? Freshman year. 13 and 14 is middle school. Middle school is tough enough because you're in those tween years anyway, So that's what I know. Education is so important, but I still believe sometimes that we still need to keep that sort of parachute wide open so that they can explore if they're interested in STEM. And I think a lot are, because you look down the road and that's where the job opportunities are.
Right.
But I want them to explore their whole self and their whole line of interests as well as what element of STEM really drives.
That
Because
makes perfect
as again, be broad and then narrow as you move up that food chain. And so that
Mhm.
you don't get burned out. Because I'll tell you, we're seeing burnout in our young physicians. I know two who have graduated within the last 12 years and they're already leaving the field. Their whole life up to they're in their mid 30s has been committed to this, actually later 30s. So maybe knocking at 40's door, leaving. And I don't want that to happen. I think we channel young people in one direction. We do all this testing and we sort of peg, okay, you do this and you do, and then they get there and it's sort of like, is that all there is? And it's not for them. So that's why I think start broad and like a funnel, and then hone in as you move up the educational food chain. We
so
like, you want the person to be a whole person and explore, you know, the right and left sides of the brain and
yeah.
artistic talent. I mean, what I have found, and I know this is about girls in STEM, but what I have found is that our society is placing so much emphasis on STEM, we're losing the arts, and that we cut out the arts programs in schools. So that if
Mhm.
someone, and particularly for music, but also the other creative arts, um, I just that's why I say explore all the interests, and then take that acronym apart. What is it about STEM that attracts you? Is it, and be honest, is it because I look down the road and I see, well, that's where I'm going to be able to get a job? Or
Mhm.
is that truly where my interests lie? Or then, even at 13, 14, and 15, what do I do best in school? And
Mhm.
why? Am I good in my English classes, or am I better in my math and science classes? That also should tell you something.
Mhm.
But this is not to discourage the person who likes to write short stories or write poetry from saying, okay, then science is not for you, because that's not the case either.
Right.
Keep
And
that
I
creative side open. That's all I'm trying to say.
But that's all that I have for you, Dr. McMahon. I really enjoyed this
Well,
talk.
I
I
have
really,
too. I have too. And let me know any follow up. But I wish you well in this endeavor, because I think it's great to reach out to young women at this point and just let them know, there's so many options, and but
yeah.
but explore them. Don't
Mhm.
and again, taking that, we throw the acronym around, but
Mhm.
what part of it would they be most interested in? So
Well,
great.
thank you
This
so
was, this
much.
was
This
fun.
was.
Okay. Have a
All
great day.
right. You too. We'll
All
be in
right.
touch.
Bye bye.